Hi, everyone. First off, I am sorry that I had to do this video with AI. If it's any consolation, I am doing more and more real videos these days, but time and energy constraints made me rely on AI for this production. Today, I want to dive into what I call conversational intimacy. I wrote about this concept together with Aspasia Kara-George in a paper titled The Charmer, and you'll find a link to that paper in the description section. Conversational intimacy is also inspired by Carl Rogers' person-centered approach, and I'll include a link to another paper I wrote titled ISTDP with a person-centered emphasis. Habib Davanloo meets Carl Rogers. For all I know, conversational intimacy, and the way I think about it, may not be original at all, but it captures an orientation I find essential for fostering authenticity and psychological contact in therapy, an approach I learned from my teacher, Marvin Scorman. Conversational intimacy is often a form of capacity building that can help undo unconscious reenactments, getting out of shoes. It's particularly useful when corrective emotional experiences take priority over major mobilization of the unconscious. It can also support restructuring efforts. I'm going to discuss conversational intimacy in the context of the graded and psychic integration formats. My hope is to show how conversational intimacy draws from each of these formats, while standing on its own as a distinct category. While Davanloo did not use the term conversational intimacy, I will refer to a component of his work that is particularly aligned with it. Let's start with some quick definitions. This is how I define these terms. Graded format is the titrated injection of intensity in the service of capacity building. It involves moving towards capacity thresholds, pushing up to the edge of what the patient can handle, and then backing off and repeating the cycle. It's about titrating pressure and challenge to help patients build capacity. It often involves shifting the focus on different stations on the triangle of person, from the transference to the current, and so on. Psychic integration, on the other hand, is about helping the patient integrate fragmented and split-off parts of the psyche. Some clinicians use the term specifically in the context of working with severely fragile individuals. This is the narrower use of the term. However, in Catherine Hickey's book, Understanding Davanloo's Intensive Short-Term Dynamic Psychotherapy, she seems to suggest a broader understanding. Psychic integration isn't limited to fragile patients, but can describe any therapeutic work that leads to greater clarity, perspective, and self-cohesion. In Hickey's book, there are multiple references to psychic integration in the context of clinical work with patients who are not fragile, supporting this broader understanding. In this wider sense, psychic integration seems to be the outcome of any and all therapeutic progress. The person who experiences psychological healing is more psychologically integrated, even if the divisions in the unhealed psyche were not a result of primitive splitting and projection. Typically, psychic integration involves cognitive work on the triangles, without pushing the patient to the edge of their capacity. It's about encouraging self-reflection and healing split-off parts of the psyche in ways that foster clarity, perspective, and self-cohesion. It's a more cognitive approach that brings out the whole self, ensuring that there is a present embodied patient in the room, someone who can inhabit their first-person perspective and develop a more stable sense of subjectivity. This work often becomes a prerequisite for any deeper mobilization of the unconscious. Conversational intimacy is not a technique in the traditional sense, but rather an interpretive frame that really shapes a strengths-based therapeutic orientation. The therapist adopting this stance seeks to highlight and nurture glimmers from the unconscious therapeutic alliance, like patient behaviors that signal movement towards greater openness and honesty. These are moments of increased authenticity that, relative to the patient's starting point, represent a shift towards the patient finding or reclaiming their true voice. Such moments, no matter how small, are framed as successful engagement in the therapeutic task, helping the patient recognize their own capacity for honesty and closeness. In this way, conversational intimacy lowers the bar for success. It doesn't insist on the complete removal of resistance, but instead celebrates and supports even modest steps towards greater genuineness. Let me elaborate on what I mean by conversational intimacy. These shifts towards greater openness at the conversational level, regardless of the intensity of feelings involved, often signify acts of taking down walls, becoming less defended, and therefore allowing for greater emotional closeness. While conversational intimacy doesn't push patients to their capacity thresholds, as the graded format does, it incorporates the principle of titration, adjusting the therapist's input to match the patient's readiness in the moment. At its core, conversational intimacy is about fostering psychological contact through attuned, transparent engagement. It's a form of slow burn pressure, a gentle, sustained pressure that isn't about rapidly mobilizing the unconscious, but about drawing out the patient's experience in a way that helps them acknowledge and articulate the truth of their feelings in a conversational manner, rather than through more traditional, intensive efforts. By traditional methods, I'm referring to the technique of pressure and stacked pressures, repeated, often rapid questions about what the patient feels and how they feel it. These methods are techniques the therapist applies to the patient. Conversational intimacy, on the other hand, is not a technique applied to the patient. It's a way of being with the patient that organically exerts pressure on any and all aspects of the patient that connect to emotional intimacy and closeness. Davenlu didn't use the term conversational intimacy, but when he distinguishes bringing out feelings from mobilizing feelings, he touches on this component. For Davenlu, bringing out feelings refers to helping the patient acknowledge the truth of what they feel without necessarily pushing for intensification or a greater rise. Therapist transparency as organic pressure and the real relationship. For the therapist, conversational intimacy involves being a real person in the room, not a blank screen. It means appropriately showing some of your own reactions and mannerisms, trusting that your authentic presence invites the patient to let down their walls. That transparency, like thoughtfully sharing with the patient how they're impacting you, or perhaps briefly sharing a bit about your own life in response to a question, can be a gentle form of pressure. It pushes against the patient's resistance to emotional closeness and to a two-person relationship, but in an organic, natural way that removes any sense in the patient that they are being worked on. The other day, someone I worked with years ago called me to come back for sessions. She overheard my toddler crying in the background and asked about it. I explained that it was my son she was hearing. She asked me what my son's name was, and I told her. I didn't go into a lot of detail, but I answered her questions, and thanked her for being happy for me. This is an example of allowing for some transparency in the service of making me a real person. As Dr. Osimo says, when the therapist conveys to the patient that they are a real person, it increases the power of the technical interventions. This can be as simple as allowing your facial expressions to reveal genuine surprise, happiness in the patient's progress, disgust at something described, or concern about the direction of the session. It's not in the service of exploiting the patient's tendency towards compliance and people-pleasing. It's in the service of fostering the real relationship and allowing this relationship to become its own form of organic pressure on the patient's psychodynamics. It's pressure through attunement. Conversational intimacy as psychic integration. And here's the final piece: how this fits with psychic integration. When done well, conversational intimacy is more than just talk. It helps the patient build perspective, see the contrast between their defenses and their real self, and gently expose themselves to emotional closeness. This gradual exposure fosters corrective emotional experiences. Over time, the patient develops a more stable, cohesive sense of self by learning to show up authentically in the relationship with increased perspective, clarity, and understanding of important links and connections. So, to sum it up, conversational intimacy isn't a form of the graded format or psychic integration. It's a distinct orientation in its own right. While it draws from elements of both, like the graded approach's attention to titration and the goals of psychic integration, conversational intimacy stands apart as a way of working that prioritizes psychological contact, relational safety, and authentic connection. It offers a gentle, steady form of slow burn pressure that's not about pushing to the patient's edge, but about creating a space where honesty, openness, and a more cohesive experience of self can naturally unfold. Check out the 2 papers linked in the description section for more about these ideas. If you're a therapist or someone interested in this kind of work, I hope this helps you see how conversational intimacy can be a powerful tool, not just for breakthroughs, but for gently building a foundation of trust, safety, and insight. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.